Okay. Hi everyone. So my name is Mafaro Makiwa, and I'm going to be going over setting up your own server with you. So you can ask yourself, what is actually a server? Like, I think you've heard us talk about server during the previous workshops we've gone through. And the way that I want you to think about a server is a server, it's simply just like a machine that's constantly running some piece of program. And with this server setup, like I think we're talking about Heroku server this morning. We're talking about the Heroku server like being overloaded and everything. So there's just like a piece of machine that is constantly running this piece of code. And then there is a client, which is your machine. It can be your phone, your iPad, your laptop. And what you do with your client or your machine is you send a request to the server. So I think if you remember during today's workshop, we were trying to do a GET request to get the stories to render them on the page. So you send your request to the server, and what the server does, it sends back a response to you. So that response is probably, like in our case, it was a list of stories that you guys were posting throughout the workshops. And the other thing I want you to note as well is that you can have several clients that are connecting to the same server at once. So I think this morning what happened is you saw that we couldn't like get some responses because we had a lot of people trying to access the same server. So you can have so many clients like your phone, your laptop trying to access the same server at the same time. So this server can handle requests from multiple clients at the same time, which brings me to why we actually need a server. So the first thing is you might want to have some place where you can access some files, say some images that you post. So on Facebook, you make some posts and you want a way for you to access those files. And you also want a way to centralize your information. So take, for instance, in our workshop, you guys, you were making your post to our server, like creating some stories, creating some comments. So when I created my own comment, when Noah posted his own comment, everyone could see it because we had one single source of truth, which is made possible by our server to have sort of like a centralization of information. And we can also talk about security, which you might have noticed as well that during the entire workshops, someone would right click on a specific element on your page, and then you can do inspect element. So you could see some code on that page, like actually the HTML code you've written. But when you write your server code, which I'm going to go over in a moment, the client cannot have access to that. So it helps you to maintain security in your applications, which we'll talk more about when you do authentication, which means like anyone who's trying to access your website doesn't have access to like say passwords or anything that you have on the server. The next thing I want to talk about is processes and ports. So your server binds to a port on a computer. So what this basically means is in our context, like if you remember, when you're trying to run your React code, you do localhost 5,000. So 5,000 is that specific port on which you're trying to access your server. And the way that I want you to think about ports is you can think of your server or this machine simply being some kind of a hotel. And then the port is like a room in that hotel. So this is just an analogy just to explain what ports are pertaining to your server or this machine. So this is just an example of a website and then accessing it at a specific port. And so the way that you specify this is you have a protocol, which is, in this case, you can have HTTP, HTTPS, and then a domain, and then a port. I'm going to talk about domain in more detail in the next slide. So you can then ask yourself that we're talking about ports, like you access a specific server at a specific port. Why is it that when you access some websites, let's say google.com, you don't have to specify a port? And this is because you are implicitly accessing a specific port or a certain port, but then there are certain processes or the certain ports that are reserved for certain processes. So you don't have to specify these ports when you're trying to access a certain server. So moving on, you can actually run some server code on your machine. And the way that you do that is by using a specific domain, which is called localhost. So I think just to give you a reminder, you would do localhost 5,000 for you to run your React code. So localhost is a specific domain you're trying to access. And previously we talked about protocol, localhost, and then the port number. So localhost is the specific domain on which your server is going to run. And here is an example of accessing a server at port 3000 and the domain being localhost. In this case, our protocol is just HTTP. So now that we sort of like have a basic overview of what a server actually is, you can then ask yourself, how do I actually get to write my server code? And the way that you do that is not only one, there's a couple of ways. There's a framework called Flask, which is in Python, Django, which is in Python, Apache, which is in Java. And there's also Express, which is what we teach you in Web Lab. So Express is in JavaScript. And the way that you run your Express code, you need a tool to help you to do that, which we are going to use in this case is Node. Node, yeah, basically this is the tool that we're going to be using for you to be able to run your Express code or your server code. And you've also heard us talk about npm install, npm run loader, and then you can ask yourself, what is actually npm? So npm is just a Node package manager that you basically use to manage your packages or dependencies that you're going to be using in your project. So like your projects are going to be making use of a couple of dependencies, a couple of packages, and this Node package manager is what you can use to handle all those packages. So the next thing I want to talk about is these packages you're going to be using in your project. And you have seen when you're defining your components that you would do at the top import React from React. You didn't actually get to write the React code, but you're simply importing an external library. And the way that your project or the way that your code knows how to do that is through this file that you might have seen called package.json. So what this file simply contains is that it has a lot of things. It has some metadata about the project. In this case, you can see there's the name specified, which is normally is probably going to be the name of your project. You don't have to worry much about these things. But what I want to draw your attention to is that dependencies JSON object. So here, what you simply do is where you list down all the packages that you're going to be using, that external code you're talking about, that you're going to be using in your code or in your project. So how this works is every time that you type npm install, npm is what it simply does. It goes through this list of packages, this list of dependencies, and it installs all of them one by one. And then it creates this folder called node modules. So if you're paying attention to the first time that you ran npm install, you might have seen a certain folder called node modules just pop up. So that's the one that contains all that external code that's being used in your project. So yeah, this is the basic overview of what a server is. And I'm just going to go over our code base to just explain how this all works. Just give me a moment. Okay, so can everyone hear me? Okay. So I'm just going to show you guys how you can actually get to set up the server. So here is just, can everyone see this? Is this better? Okay. So I think for most of you guys, this is probably the first time that you're going to be working with a project with a lot of files. Like in this case, you can see we have a client folder, which is a lot of files in it. I'm sure like we've been working mainly with this client folder. We have components, modules, pages, and everything. And we also have this folder now called server, which contains this file server.js. I'm going to talk more about this file. Okay, so you probably notice as well that there's a lot of files in this project. Like some of them, they probably don't even make sense to you. Like in this case, you see this package log.json. We just talked about package.json. And there's a lot of files in here. You don't really have to worry much about them. But if you want to know about what each of the specific files is doing, you can always ask the staff members to explain this to you. They would be happy to do so. But what I want to draw your attention to is this file in server, in the server folder called server.js. So this is the one in which we're basically going to define everything to do with our server. Here, there's just a comment that's there to explain in more detail what I've just been talking about, what a server is. So yeah, that's just basically about the folder structure that we're going to be working with. So here you can see the first thing in this file is this line. So what this is doing is basically importing that Express library we're going to be using to write our server code. And I want to draw your attention to one distinction. So when you're writing your client code, if you remember, you would do something like, let me just open one component. When you're trying to import, say, like this singleton, this single story component, you do import single story from this specific file. But then the way that you import packages in your server is different from the way you do it on the client side. So you use the special keyword called require. So what you're basically doing here, you are trying to import that Express library that we're going to be using to write the server code. And then here, you're simply creating an instance of this Express server that we're going to be working with. And here we're just basically specifying the port on which we're going to be running our server code. So just to show you that this is working, if I navigate to localhost 3000, it's saying cannot get, and this is fine. I'm going to explain why this is actually happening. But just to also talk about, to show you how this port is actually working, if I was to change this to, let's say, port 3001, and then if I was to come back and reload my page and then go to localhost 3001, you see this is still working because it's just the port, you're specifying the port that this is working on. Let me just switch it back to what we had. Yeah, so this is basically it about this file so far. Let's move on to our slides. So what I want to go over with you guys right now is how to create your first API endpoint. So if you remember from what you're doing in the workshops earlier on, you were sort of like making a GET request from your client side. And you're trying to get the stories from the Heroku server, which, I mean, in our workshop, it was crashing because of a lot of requests we were sending to it at the same time. But basically what we were doing is we're trying to access a specific endpoint in our server. And the way that you do that is by using this code, this thing called app.get is a function. And here what I'm doing, you're specifying this specific HTTP method that you want to use. So we talked about get, we talked about post. There are several HTTP methods. If you Google, you can probably hear something about something called patch, something called delete, and there's a bunch of them. But in this case, we're trying to create an endpoint to get something from the server. So we do app.get. And the first argument you pass to this function is the specific route that you want to access for that specific thing. So in this case, we are specifying the route, which is /API/test. In our case, we're doing /API/stories to get the stories we wanted. So this is the endpoint that you access from your client side. And then the next argument to this function is the function handler. So I want you to pay attention to this function as well, because if you mix up some things, you might end up having some bugs you won't expect. So in this case, this function, what it takes in two arguments, which is a request and a response. So what the request simply is the request that the client is sending to the server. And then the response is what the server spits back to the client. So in our workshops, we are sending a request to get some stories, which is part of this request object. And then the server sends back a response. And you do that by using this function called rest.send. So you can think of rest.send as kind of like a return statement we use in our functions to send back some information from the server back to the client. So one thing I want you to really take note is please do not switch rec and res, because if you do that, when you try to access them in this function handler, it may not work. So the first argument is the rec, and then this the second argument is the response. So to implement this in our code, I will just show you how. So here is our first endpoint we've implemented, which is API/test. And if you go back to our browser now, if you go to localhost 3000 /API/test, now we see our message pop up. So this is our first endpoint for us to get this message from our backend. So moving on, yeah, so this is just showing us that this is the expected response when you access this endpoint. So our servers can run into a couple of errors. I think if you remember from today's workshop, when Clay tried to go to the network tab, you saw there was a 543 error that was popping up. There was a specific error which was happening. And there's also another error which normally happens, which is a 500. I think from the lecture yesterday, Noah talked about status codes. There are 200, which indicate like okay responses. 404, you might have seen a lot of error codes when you're trying to access certain websites. So you want to have your server have a way to handle these errors when they happen. And the way you do that is by making use of this function, which is different from what we've been seeing earlier on. We're seeing app.get, app.post, and so forth. But here we see something called app.use. And this is basically what's called middleware. I'm going to talk more about it later. But this is, you can think of it as something that happens or some function that runs in between the time that you make your request and right before the response is sent back to the client. So you want something to happen in between those two processes. And in this case, if an error is to happen, you want to be able to tell the user that a certain error has happened. So what we do here, you want to get the status code from the error. So this function that you pass into this specific middleware it takes 4 arguments, which is the error, the request from the client, the response, which you send back to the client, and then next, we don't have to worry about the request, and next, you're going to make use of the error and the response. And what happens here is that we want to get the status code from this error. So that's what the slime is doing in line 27. And just to explain the syntax here, if error.status is not defined in our error, then we just default it to 500. And I will get the error. And then now, if we get a status code of 500, which simply signals an internal server error, we want to sort of like log or to tell the user that this error has happened. So we're just logging this here. And then in our response, the one we send back to the client, if you remember when you go on the network tab, maybe I can just do it with, if I go to, just a moment. Maybe I can just open like this drive. Let me go to Catbook here. If you go to the network tab right here, you will see a list of all the network calls you have made. And if I'm to just run this, here you see this pop-up, which is specifically telling you the name of the call that you've made. This is the URL. And then the method for that, which was get in this case. And then the status code that came back because of, as a result of this request. In this case, is 200, which is an okay. So when this is to happen, sorry, where are my slides? So if you're to encounter an error, you want to update the status code of that error, which you will see when you go on the network tab. And then you now want to send back to the client an object which contains that status code and then the error message that you encountered on the server. So you access the message by just doing error.message, and then you just put the status code as well, which would be part of that, JSON object that the user gets as a response. So just to show you how this looks in code, I'm just going to check out to step 2. And here is how we have defined, we've implemented our error handling. So moving on, so there are cases whereby you access a certain endpoint that you haven't defined. So if I come back to where we try to access localhost 3000, So what's happening here, we're trying to access an endpoint which we haven't defined on our server. And the response that you get by default in this case is this error saying cannot get /. And if you come to your network tab, which is going to be useful when you're trying to do with your servers, you see this error that happened. It's saying localhost, and you see the status code is 404, which is saying not found. If you try to go to localhost /test, you will see it's going to pop up again because you're trying to access an endpoint which you haven't defined. So you also get an error code, which is 404. So in cases like this, what we want is we want to have a way to handle such errors when they happen. And it's hard for you to anticipate for all these errors. Like a user can access /test with 1E, /test with 2 E's, and it can be anything. And you want a way for you to handle those errors when they happen. So the way you do that is by what's called this catch-all endpoint. So what this catch-all endpoint is simply a way for you to say when any of these errors which you hadn't anticipated when they happen, you want a way to maybe signal that this error has happened, or just a fail-safe way for that specific error. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to display a certain page when this error happens. And the one that we're trying to display in this case is our catbook, the catbook index.html file, just to signal that this error has happened. So the way we do that is now we introduce another concept. In this case, we want to install, we want to make use of this library called path. And we do the same thing that we do when you're trying to sort of like import a library by doing the require. So what this path helps us to do is just to give us a means to work with files and directory paths. So what the next thing we do now is we want to get the path to a specific file that we want to send back to the client when we are encountering an error. And what we're trying to access here, if I'm to just come back to the code, is we want to send back this index.html file, which is in the distribution folder. So if you go to your client, is this file which is in the dist folder. So this is what we want to spit back to the client when we encounter an error. And what this line is basically doing is it's getting the path to this specific folder, the distribution folder, which contains the index.html file. And this is possible by this function path.resolve. And this directory name, it's simply the name of the current directory we're currently in. So these two dots, it's simply saying move one level out of the current folder we are in. So we are in server.js because we're in server.js, this file, and it's in the server folder. So these two dots are trying to signal, we are trying to get one level out of this folder. And then we are now in this catbook create folder. And then now we try to get into the client folder, which is this one. And then the next thing that we do is to get to this dist folder. So now we are in this distribution folder. So this is simply a path to this distribution folder. And then the next thing we do, we talked about middleware. So for us to be able to send back these static files to the client, we now want to tell Express, and we do that through middleware by using express.static to simply tell it that you can send back files that are specified in this path. So we created our path react path, which now tell to Express that it can use this path to send back these files. And then the way that we define our endpoint, you have seen app.get, and the way that you specify any of these endpoints which you're not anticipating is by using this asterisk. And we pass in the same function which we talked about, which takes in a request and a response. But then now the difference is instead of using rest.send, which we used earlier on, now you do rest.send file. So what this is doing is you're trying to send back a file to the client side. And the file you want to send is this index.html file. So the way that you do that is you want to, so we created a path to the folder that contains the index.html file, and you want to send back the index.html file. So you want to have the path to that specific file. And the way you do that is by using this path.join function. So you're simply joining the path to the distribution folder, and then you want to have it point exactly to the index.html file. So this is what this line does. And to show you how this actually works, if you come back to our code, so here, if I come to server.js, we now see this error handling implemented for us here. And if I'm to go back to localhost 3000, if I navigate to this, now it spits back that file, which we were talking about. So this is basically the way that we can handle these specific errors which can happen in our server. So moving on, so actually this is just a summary of all the code we've written so far for our server. So just to explain this one more time, the first two lines, we are sort of like importing these libraries. We're using Express and Path. Line 20, we're creating that instance of the Express server. 22 to 24, we are creating that endpoint that's spitting back this message to the client. And then line 27 to 33, this is basically what's doing the error handling, which you're talking about. So one other thing I want to draw your attention to is just to be careful the way that you define your endpoints in your servers. So here we have two examples which look like they are, we expect them to do the same thing, but actually they do not. And the left one is good, the right one is bad. And I'm just going to explain why this is the case. So the way, when you try to navigate to a specific endpoint, when the server receives that request, it tries to match that endpoint from the first endpoint that you have in order. So like suppose you try to do a GET request, it tries to match that endpoint in order from top to bottom. So if you try to navigate to API, so /API/test, what's going to happen is it's going to try to match that GET request with all these endpoints that you have defined in your server. And when it matches the first one, it executes the function handler for that, and then it terminates, that's it. So in this case, if you go to API/test, it's going to do what you expect it to do on the left side. But then this last one, what it does is if you navigate to API/anything, in this case, if you go to API/test, it's going to match the first one, so that's good. But if you do anything which is not test, it's going to navigate to anything else other than test. Let's say if you do API/tested, whatever, it's going to execute this function handler for this endpoint. But then if you write them the other way, in this case, when you try to navigate to API/test, when you do localhost 3000 API/test, what's going to happen is it's going to try to match it from the first GET request you have defined, which is API/*. And when it matches that, it's just going to execute the function handler for that specific endpoint you have defined, and then it's going to terminate. So it won't even get to this one that you actually wanted to run. So the main takeaway from this is that you need to define your endpoints from the most specific to the least specific, just like what we have done on the left side. And moving on, so like here, if you notice, we're trying to access our server on localhost 3000, but you have also been accessing your React code on localhost 5000. So you can then ask yourself, like, why are we using two different things? So this is coming back to what you talked about ports. So localhost 5000, you're just specifying that that's where you're accessing your React code, which is on port 5000. And you're running your server where it's listening for any request that you make on localhost 3000. So in the upcoming workshops, you'll probably be told to open 3 terminals. You would run localhost 5000 in one. If I'm to just go back to VS Code here, I have one terminal in which I'm running localhost 3000. You'll probably have to create another terminal in which you're going to run npm run hotloader. And this is going to help you to sort of like, I think I need to do npm install for this. It's fine. But this is just going to help you to sort of like listen to where I'm supposed to, I think, do this here. Okay, yeah. So in this case, like I think for some people, you might have come across this problem with port 5000 on Macs. So I think some other solution you might have been told was to change this to port 5050. But anyway, so in this case, you're now running your React code, or you're saving your React code on port 5050, and you have your server running on port 3000. And the third terminal, you probably need it to run your Git commands. Like in this case, you're probably going to check out to the next branch for the work job. So this is what's going to help you to do that. So in case you will talk about 3 terminals, this is basically what they are about. So yeah, that's it mainly on setting up your own server. I know this might have been a bit confusing if it's your first time to see this, but you can always post on Piazza or ask questions about this if you want any more clarifications. I will leave this time to Noah to continue from here.